World War II internment of German civilians in Australia, marking the 80th anniversary of German internees' arrival in Australia. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the first Australian peoples as the traditional custodians of this country and their continued connection to land, sea and culture. I pay my respects to all first Australian peoples. My name is Doris Frank. I'm interested in this story from several points of view. In my roles within the Temple Society Australia's Heritage and Culture Focus Group, and as a member of the research team of German civilian internees from Iran project. I also have a personal interest in this history as my parents belong to two of the groups of German civilians interned in Australia. My father is one of the Germans transported from Iran, and my mother is one of the Templars transported from her homeland in what was in 1941 still Palestine and now is Israel. 2021 marks the 80th anniversary of the arrival in Australia of several groups of overseas Germans for internment in camps for civilians during the Second World War. In September 1939, Australia joined Great Britain in declaring war on Germany and immediately passed legislation enabling the internment of Australian civilians who might represent a threat to national security. In June 1940, the Australian government agreed to also accommodate Britain's civilian internees, as well as thousands of civilians detained by the Allies in Palestine, Persia, South Africa, Singapore, and other parts of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. By the end of 1943, there were members of 9 nations in the 4 internment camps at Tatura, Victoria, and the 3 camps at Loveday in South Australia. The focus of this presentation is on 4 of the groups of German civilian internees: the German Australians, the Germans from Persia or Iran, the Templars and other Germans from Palestine, and the Germans from New Guinea. These civilians, either already living in Australia or transported from overseas, were primarily interned at camps in Loveday, South Australia, and Tatura in Victoria. Further groups of Germans were interned in the Tatura camps, but are only mentioned briefly here. Those commonly known as the Dinera boys, who were transported on the ship the Dinera in 1940, as part of a group of over 2,000 men from Britain, and the group of just over 200 Germans and Austrians from Singapore and the Strait settlements, also interned in Camp 3, but in D compound, separate to the rest. Much of the preparation to accommodate internees by both the British and Australian authorities was done in haste. Looking back today, you might well wonder why so many local civilians, that is, naturalised British subjects living in Australia for many years, were interned. One needs to understand the situation at the time. An atmosphere of wartime hysteria surrounding anything labelled German or connected to Germany meant that all and sundry labelled as enemy alien or a threat to national security were rounded up with little regard for individual circumstances. Overwhelmed by the numbers of internees to be dealt with, mistakes were also made as identities and nationalities were confused or failed to be verified. These 10 persons are individuals selected from the 4 groups of German internees. The features they all had in common are that they all came from a German background and were civilians interned in various camps in Australia during World War II. Bonds were created during years of living together in internment and after release. Each had some connection to members of the Temple Society. Most were transported here against their will, some from half a world away, in many cases leaving family and loved ones behind. Others, despite having called Australia home for many years and been naturalised, still found themselves classed as a threat to national security and interned for the duration of the war. Some were unable or refused permission to return to their homelands after release. Some chose to be repatriated to Germany after release. Some remained here for some time and then moved on. Many opted to remain in Australia and create a new life here. Several camps were designated as men-only camps, although for short periods of time they also housed some women. These were Camps 1 and 2 in Tatura and Camps 10 and 14 in Loveday. Many of the single men from our group spent time in several of the camps, as they were transferred by the Australian authorities between the Loveday and Tatura camps. Many of these men deemed single had left their families behind when taken into internment. Family groups were housed in Camp 3 Rushworth. This was one of two family camps, the other being Camp 4, which primarily housed Japanese families. Known as Australian Germans are the German families who had lived in Australia, in some cases, for many years. The men, many of them from Queensland and New South Wales, were deemed a risk to national security or simply an enemy alien and arrested from 1939 onwards. After initial detention in such places as Gaythorne Camp in Brisbane, they were brought to Camp 1 Tatura. Later, when their families joined them, they were transferred to Camp 3. Here depicted are the Bainson and the Gluckermann families. Members of the Temple Society, a Christian faith community originating in southwest Germany in 1861, family groups of Germans who had lived in Palestine for several generations, 535 in number, with a smaller group of other Germans from Palestine, 665 in total, were transported on the Queen Elizabeth to Sydney. From there, they completed their journey to internment in Victoria by rail and bus. Arriving in Camp 3 Tatura in the Goulburn Valley on the chilly afternoon of August 25, 1941. This was to be home for at least the next 5 years. The journey from Palestine is documented as having taken exactly 24 days and 12 hours. Most of this group of internees was not released until 1946. The majority of the family groups chose to remain and settled in Australia. Here are the Richard Kratze and Oskar Hahn families in B compound. German civilians living and working in Iran were to experience a similar fate to the Templars following the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran on August 25, 1941. The very day the Templars were settling into their new internment surroundings after transportation from Palestine. The British invaded the neutral country, Iran, from the south and the Soviets from the north. In the process, 50 sailors from the German Merchant Navy and approximately 500 civilians became prisoners, many in Tehran. After spending a number of weeks in a British camp in Basra, Iraq, they were shipped to Australia. They began their periods of internment in Australian camps on the 20th of November, almost 3 months after the Palestine group. The civilians interned were mostly unattached males, having been separated from their wives and children in Iran. A small group of 6 families, 16 people in total, were interned in the Tatura Family Camp 3. The women and children in Iran were repatriated in groups to Vienna and Germany via Turkey. The first group leaving Tehran on September 17, 1941. These people spent the war years and beyond in Germany, some of them with family or wherever they could find accommodation. They suffered through the bombings, dislocation and post-war hardships. Most of this group of internees was not released until 1946. The single men from Camp 1 Tatura and the families from Camp 3. Over half the group chose to remain and settled in Australia. Many families later travelled from Germany to join their husbands and fathers in Australia. Pictured here is the Rudolf Girschik family from Iran, together with the Daniel Strecker family from Palestine, who lived diagonally opposite them in A compound. Many of the German Lutheran missionaries living in New Guinea were rounded up and brought to Australia by ship to Sydney in batches from October 1939. The first group was initially transferred to Melbourne, where they spent several weeks at Worths Park, which had been converted to an internment camp. Later, they were brought by train to the Tatura camps. Most were housed in Camp 1B. Meanwhile, the women and children remained free. Later, they were flown to Cairns. From there, they were brought to South Australia by train, where they were billeted with Lutheran families in the Barossa Valley. After a time, this became untenable, the locals uncomfortable supporting Germans, and the missionary wives did not want their children attending English-speaking schools. So it was agreed that they would be reunited with their husbands and fathers and interned in Tatura, the men joining their families in Camp 3. Michael Bear, pictured here on the right, became one of the camp school teachers. When it came time for release, some were refused permission to return to New Guinea and chose instead to be repatriated to Germany, travelling on the General Stuart Heinzelmann in late November 1947. Others remained in Australia, some until they were given permission to return to New Guinea. A few opted to stay on in Australia permanently. A number of ships made the trip, bringing internees and POWs to Australia, with perhaps the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth being two of the most well-known. The Macdui brought the internees from New Guinea to Australia. The Rona brought the Persian group of Germans from Basra to Bombay, where they were transshipped onto the Ranjitiki for the rest of the journey to Adelaide, arriving on the 19th of November. Stealing from and damaging internees' luggage, as on the ship the Danira, also occurred on the Rona, the ship that brought the group of Germans from Persia to Bombay in October 1941. The journey aboard the Ranjitiki also was undertaken in vastly overcrowded conditions, with poor food available. Templars who travelled on the Queen Elizabeth in August 1941 told stories of overcrowding, poor treatment by guards, and unpleasant conditions on board. The only available food was particularly unsuitable for infants and compounded their distress. However, on a more positive note, we know that there were some very good outcomes on the Queen Elizabeth. Several relationships between individuals from the internees from Palestine group and those of the German-Austrian POWs began on this journey. Franz Kolbe, one of the Austrian POWs, later married Lieselotte Strecker, a Templar from the Palestine group. Templar Gerd Abele is said to have met his future wife, Emma Hermann, also a Templar, on board the Queen Elizabeth. The sites for the camps in Loveday in South Australia and Tatura in Victoria were chosen for their isolated locations, far away from the sea, with sufficient infrastructure such as water and electricity to support the large numbers of internees and army personnel required to man the camps. Loveday is near Böhmer in the Renmark district of South Australia. There were 3 main camps, 9, 10 and 14. They housed single males, mostly Italians, Germans and Japanese, but also individuals of other nationalities caught up along the way. Tatura is in the Goulburn Valley region of Victoria. There were 7 camps there, camps 1 and 2, both on the eastern side of the Waranga Basin. On the western side, camps 3 and 4, Rushworth. The Murchison POW Camp 13, with its annex, the Durringile Mansion, and the bush cutting camp Greytown, further south, between Heathcote and Nagambie. The civilian camps, numbers 1 to 4, had a nominal capacity of 1,000 persons each. POW Camp 13 housed about 4,000, Durringile about 200, and Greytown about 250. German internees were primarily housed in camps 10 and 14 in Loveday. Camp 10 was rectangular in shape with 39 buildings and a 20-bed hospital. It was adjacent to Camp 9 and approximately 1.5 kilometres from Camp 14. In December 1942, the Loveday camps held 634 Germans. The internees were housed in barracks. The usual camp photos show the huts without any people and give little indication of what it must have been like to live in such close quarters with so many others and so little privacy. This is a view of the interior of one of the newer huts in Camp 10. This painting was done by Fritz Bumbach, one of the internees from Iran. Each hut housed 24 men. The bed frames stood along the walls and had a half-height dividing wall between them. The beds had timber frames with wire stretched across them, covered with a hessian bag filled with straw, serving as a mattress. Each internee received a number of woolen blankets. The barracks were cramped, with little room for storage. The internees had to build their own furniture, such as tables and chairs, from scrounged wood supplies. Camp 14 was of a different design to the earlier camps, octagonal in shape and had 4 compounds within. Each compound was designed to hold 1,000 occupants and contained 18 double sleeping huts, 4 large mess halls, each capable of seating 250 persons, 2 large kitchens to cook for 500 persons, 2 latrines, 2 wash houses and ablution blocks, work and hobby huts. The layout for the Murchison POW camp in Victoria was similar. The single men from Iran and those from Palestine interned in Camp 10 were transferred to Camp 14A in January 1944. In January 1945, they were all transferred to Camp 1 Tatura in Victoria, as the camps at Loveday were being closed. Camp 1 Tatura was Australia's first purpose-built internment camp for housing enemy aliens and or POWs, with 2 compounds separated by barbed wire. It had a capacity of 1,000 persons, housing male civilian internees, most of German origin, and later Italians who had been resident in Australia. The men from the Australian Germans and the New Guinea groups were initially housed here before their transfer to Camp 3. The men from the Loveday camps were transferred here in January 1945. Camp 3 internees knew it as the Männerlager. Camp 1 became the Chief Army Administration Camp. It eventually housed the hospital and dental headquarters for all the camps of the Tatura group and was the only one that was sewered. In April 1940, the camp was described as having 20 huts designed for 18 men each. The huts were 60 feet long and 16 feet wide, constructed of unlined corrugated iron. The beds were constructed by the inmates themselves, each having a number of woolen blankets. Heating was not yet provided, but all huts had electric lighting. In addition to the sleeping huts, there were 2 large mess halls, 2 hospital huts, 1 large kitchen and a recreation hut, a canteen, a workshop and a storage hut. Camp 3 Rushworth, built to house 1,000 internees, was designed in the shape of a diamond. It was fully enclosed by a 4-metre high barbed wire fence, then a wide strip of land without vegetation and an entanglement of barbed wire. It housed mainly German family groups in 4 compounds. A compound held Italians and Germans, B and C exclusively Germans, and D compound a mixture of German, Jewish and Italian families from Australia, Singapore and Malaya. Most compounds designed for 250 persons accommodated up to 280, and this overcrowding was exacerbated when the family groups from New Guinea were also brought for internment in 1942. Not only was each compound separately fenced in with barbed wire, but the entire facility was further surrounded by barbed wire, with sentry posts at all corners, lit up by searchlights at night and manned by soldiers armed with rifles. During daily hut inspections, the blankets had to be neatly folded at the end of the bed so that they could be counted by the camp inspection group. The internees soon learnt how to fold their blankets so that it looked like the required number were there, even though some were missing. Having little other material, the ingenious mothers had cut and sewn their children's overalls from these grey woolen blankets. The families had to cover up the shortfall in blankets somehow. At the beginning of 1943, Camp 3 Rushworth held 1,179 persons, 923 of them Germans. The entrance is secured with barbed wire and has a small watch house next to it. The whole thing looks like a gigantic rat trap. These were the first impressions of the camp by Anna Tietz, one of the Templars from Palestine, on her arrival in 1941. Two families from the Australian Germans are featured, the Lewandowsky family and the König family. The Lewandowskys were chosen because they were such an interesting case study. A naturalised Australian, British subject who had been living in Australia for over 30 years was still considered a threat in wartime Australia and interned in 1940. Many other members of Ernst Lewandowski's extended family were also interned. The König family were similarly interned as enemy aliens, but were much more recent arrivals to Australia, having come in 1937. They were chosen because of the artistic talents of Alfons König and the artworks he created within the camp. Both men were detained in 1940, their families later joining them in internment. The description given under the photo, family groups of German internees from overseas and now interned at number 1A Camp Tatura, 1945, is that given by the Australian War Memorial. Neither of these two families were German internees from overseas, but in fact, German families living in Australia at the time of internment. The Lewandowsky family, the parents, Ernst and Lieselotte, were naturalised British subjects. Ernst, born in 1890 in Berlin, had come to Queensland on an assisted migrant scheme with his parents in 1910. The family had lived in Australia for over 30 years. They were farmers at Milman near Rockhampton in Queensland. Their 5 children were all born here. All were interned. First Ernst in 1940, before Lieselotte and the children joining him in Camp 1 in 1942. The family was transferred to Camp 3 in 1943. They lived in C Compound. Other family members, father-in-law, brother, sister and husband of Ernst were also interned. His nephew was able to enlist and serve in the Australian Army, despite his father, Paul, also being interned. Ernst and Lieselotte's son Manfred was born during internment in January 1945. In that year, their British nationality was revoked after his application to become denaturalised was accepted. This photo was taken shortly before their repatriation to Germany in November 1947. Here's the Lewandowsky family in Germany, including son Hermann, born in 1950. Ernst Jr. passed away in Germany shortly after the family settled there. Hagar, the eldest, was a member of the state parliament in Lower Saxony for 16 years, and brother Lothar was Bürgermeister for Bramsche, the town in Lower Saxony where the majority of the family lived. The family did not return to Australia to live, although both Hagar and Lothar have visited Australia and met their old classmates at various class reunions. Alfons König and his wife Frieda and 2 children had come to Australia from Hamburg in 1937. He had a 2-year contract as a lithographer with a Sydney firm. Alfons was interned in 1940 as an enemy alien, and almost 2 years later, the rest of the family joined him, now with another daughter born in Sydney after the family settled there. After transfer from Camp 1A, they lived in B Compound of Camp 3. They were released in April 46 and lived at first in Currajong, New South Wales. Here they had another daughter. König returned to his pre-war employment in October 46 and they were naturalised in January 1948. He died in Katoomba, New South Wales in 1966. König was particularly well known for the artworks he created during internment. These included set designs for theatre productions, watercolour paintings, dolls and puppets created on commission, and lino cuts used in various calendars and Christmas books. A doll received by Hertha Beilharz for her 6th birthday had been made on commission by König. The doll's dress was sewn by Hertha's mother Meta and was made of dainty crepe georgette, pale pink with little flowers from an outgrown dress of Hertha's. It even had bloomers. Some of the puppets created by König for the Bainson family are on display at the Tatura Museum. Lino cuts made by König from pictures drawn by Gudrun and Loveday Frank. Some of these lino cuts were used to illustrate a calendar made for 1944. Wilhelm Eppinger was a teacher and a Templar elder. Before internment, he was the head teacher at the Lyceum Tempelstift School in Jerusalem. He became head teacher of the camp school and taught arithmetic, geography, history, algebra, geometry, singing, nature studies, and calligraphy. He was also a Templar elder, taking Sunday services and giving instruction for the 1944 and 1946 Templar confirmation groups during the internment years, and several more groups in later years after release. The Eppinger family lived in B compound. Their son Kurt completed his Abitur, his matriculation, in camp in 1945. Fritz Lippmann, another Templar, was a farmer in Sarona prior to internment, managing the family's orange grove. Fritz, his wife Mathilde, and daughters Lotte and Friedel lived in C compound of Camp 3. Fritz took over as compound leader and overall spokesman for the Camp 3 at war's end in May 1945, when the existing leaders, Gottlieb Ruf, Wilhelm Baumert, and Emil Wildermuth, were dismissed by the Australian authorities. After release, he took on a leading role in compensation negotiations regarding Templar property in Israel with the British, Israeli, and German governments. Hedwig Schnerring, another Templar, was married to Gotthold Schnerring, and they had 2 children, Helga and Günther. She was a nurse and during internment became the much-loved sister in charge of the compound first aid station known as the hospital. The military hospital, known as 28 Camp Hospital, or Waranga, was annexed to Camp 1. Many of the babies were born there. Hedwig passed away of heart failure in 1944 and was buried in the Tatura cemetery. One of the Germans from Iran group and later a Templar, my father Lothar Böhmer, was captured while his ship, the Sturmfels, was in the harbour of Bandar Shapur, Iran, in August 1941. His group of 50 sailors were transported to Australia with the other single men and the few families taken prisoner in Iran. The single men were interned in the Loveday camp in South Australia. After 6 months, the merchant navy men were reclassified as prisoner of war German Marine. The sailors were transferred to the Murchison POW camp in Tatura. Their officers were housed in the nearby Darringale mansion, annexed to Camp 13. The Murchison camp was purpose-built, the primary POW facility located in Victoria during the Second World War and the largest in Australia. In June 1943, this camp held 1,400 German ordinary ratings in the German compounds A and B. Officers housed in the nearby Darringale mansion totalled 149 at this time. In addition, there were 44 ordinary ratings, batmen to the officers, housed at Darringale. Reverting back to civilian status in late 46, Lothar was transferred to Camp 1 Tatura and released in January 47. Those from the armed forces in both the Murchison and Darringale camps were sent back to Germany in accordance with the Geneva Convention on POWs. Many journeyed on the Orontes that left Melbourne in January 1947. Having spent time in 3 different camps, Lothar said it didn't make much difference which camp you're in, civilian or POW, since they all had the same end effect of loss of freedom, boredom and a regimented life, all whilst being trapped behind barbed wire for years. After release, Lothar travelled from Tatura to Seymour and then to Sydney in the same train carriage as the Templar families of Urban Beck and Rudolf Girschik. His first job was as a cook on an outback station in Mudgee, New South Wales. He met and married Templar Irene Bayhartz, also an ex-internee in Melbourne. They worked hard at rebuilding their lives, buying a house and raising 4 children. After Irene's death in 1990, Lothar remained in the family home in Bayswater until 2005, at which time he moved to an independent living unit at the Tabulum and Templar Homes for the Aged in Bayswater. Another of the Germans from Persia was Dr. Wilhelm Eilers. He was a noted Orientalist and the head of the Deutsche Archäologische Institute at Isfahan at the time of capture in September 41. Unlike his fellow compatriots, he was not sent directly to internment in Australia, but was taken with a small number of others to Rehovot and the POW camp La Trun in Palestine for interrogation first. He arrived in Australia in December 41 on the Queen Elizabeth and then joined the other German civilians from Persia in the Loveday camp in South Australia. After release in January 1947, he took up a position as a lecturer at the University of Sydney for a time. He was able to bring out his family from Germany, wife Erika and sons Willi and Wolfhard. The family returned to Germany in 1952. He served as an expert in Oriental studies at the Westdeutsche Bibliothek in Marburg and lectured at the University in Marburg. From 1958, he taught at the Universität Würzburg until his retirement in 1974. Dr. Eilers passed away in July 1989 in Würzburg, Germany. This photo from the Loveday camp was taken in 1943. It shows 5 of the Templar boys who had been recently transferred to Loveday with some of their teachers, including Dr. Eilers. He taught Latin to these students and was later their head examiner for the Abitur examinations. Dr. Eilers was head examiner for the Abitur in both Loveday and Tatura camps. One group of 11 students in the Loveday camp in 1944 and 2 groups in Tatura, Camp 3, 11 students in 45 and another 10 students in 46. Dr. Eilers had been transferred to Camp 1 in January 1945 and was able to visit Camp 3 on numerous occasions to organise the curriculum and mark the exams. That 32 Templar students could complete a German matriculation qualification while interned in Australian camps is quite remarkable. They were thus eligible to study at a German university. Some of those who remained in Australia after some negotiation were admitted to Australian universities on the strength of this qualification. Rudolf Girschik was an engineer primarily involved with building railway bridges at the time of his capture in Schnerring, Iran. He, wife Elfriede and their 2 children, Helga and Peter, were one of only 6 family groups from Iran transported for internment in Australia. Documents reveal that the Australian authorities were expecting 1,000 German internees from Iran, men, women and children, and had envisaged using Camp 4 to house them all. When only 16 persons arrived, it was decided to put them in with the Templars in Camp 3. They were housed in A compound, as were 2 other families from Iran. In January 1945, they had another child, how about? They were released in late 46, Rudolf first and the rest of the family several months later when he could organise suitable accommodation. After release, he worked in Melbourne, in Iran for several years, and finally in Perth. Rudolf passed away in April 1989 in Perth, Western Australia. His 3 children, Helga Griffin, lives in Canberra, Peter Girschik in Melbourne, and Herbert Girschik in Perth. Helga Girschik, now Griffin, was in Frau Zischler and Lilo Wagner's class with a number of Templars, Australian Germans, and several from the New Guinea group. Peter Girschik was in Gudrun Heider's class, which was well known for having 4 Helgas in it: Helga Bulach, Helga Hoffmann, Helga König, and Helga Wied. Helga Griffin wrote a memoir of her early life experiences, Sing Me That Lovely Song Again. This book has been recently republished as an e-book with the title At Home in Exile. Germans living in New Guinea, many of them Lutheran missionaries, were rounded up and brought to internment in Australia. Their families followed them into internment some time later. Here are the Zimmermann, Fugmann and Bauer families. In 1943, they were still housed in Camp 1. Later, they were transferred to Camp 3, where the Fugmann and Zimmermann families lived in a compound. Wilhelm Fugmann was the Lutheran mission manager at Finschhafen, New Guinea, brought to internment in Australia in October 1939, with approximately 80 others. His family wife Herta and the boys Gernot and Eckehard joined him in the internment camp in Tatura in December 1942. They had lived with a Lutheran family in the Barossa Valley for the previous year. Whilst in internment, they had another 2 children, daughters Roswitha and Ingrid. The family returned to New Guinea in 1950. In 1972, Wilhelm and Herta moved to Germany. Wilhelm died in August 2007 in Germany. Fugmann was perhaps best known for being the director and producer of many of the camp theatre productions in the theatre company known as the Deutsches Theater Tatura, established in 1943. Their productions, which were highly successful and enjoyed by all, had the aim to not only fill in the time and give the internees something useful to do, but also to instil in the internees some German history and culture. The first production was Minna von Barnhelm in 1944. Other classical plays followed the first. In total, this group produced 8 plays. All work, set design and costumes were completed by the internees themselves. The actors too came from the internee group. They were accompanied by the camp orchestra. Resourceful as they were and unable to take photographs of the cast, they instead made silhouettes of the leading actors, as you can see on the left. In 1946, after the German theatre group was disbanded, the sets and props were sold to a Melbourne theatre company. The sale raised £480, which was used to organise and send food parcels to war-ravaged Germany. The internees presented Fugmann with a certificate in thanks for his leading role in the company. Martin Winkler was a missionary at the Sutterberg Mission Station in New Guinea. He was transferred by the MacDouey to Sydney and then by rail to Melbourne with many other men from New Guinea. He arrived at Tatura, Camp 1B, in December 1939. He was a widower with a son Dido, who was cared for by his aunt Anna Eiermann, both also interned in Camp 3. In July 1942, Winkler volunteered to be transferred to the Murchison POW camp and became the pastor there. After return to Camp 3 in 1945, he married Helene Strecker from Palestine in July 1946. The family was released from internment in October 1946 and settled in South Australia, where he worked as a teacher and pastor. The family expanded with a number of children born. He taught German and biology at the Ballarat Grammar School in Victoria until 1974. After moving to New Zealand, he taught German at Craighead School in Timaru until 1980. He retired at 71 years of age, having suffered a mild stroke. He died in Timaru in 1997. Information on the Loveday camps can be found at the Böhmer Visitor Information Centre. It is largely due to local historian Rosemary Gower's efforts that there is an extensive Loveday internment camp research collection there. The Temple Society has had over many years a strong association with the Tatura Irrigation and War Times Museum and members of the Tatura Historical Society. In particular, Arthur and Lurleen Nee are acknowledged here for their many years of wonderful work and collaboration with all. There are many items of camp life donated by members of the Temple Society on display at the museum. Thanks go to the museum for permission to use the photos of these items in this presentation. We hope that this close association continues into the future. Much of the data used in this presentation came from the National Archives of Australia, with photos for the Australian War Memorial, the Tatura Museum, and from our TSA archive. Other records and photos come from private family collections. Listed below are some of the useful websites for further information and photos on World War II internment in camps, on the Germans from Persia Research Group and the Temple Society Australia. Thank you.